welcome everyone. You're joining us for Stand for Kind's talk series. You got your hosts here, Candy Olant, Kristen Chapman, former teachers, now working with Stand for Kind and talking about all things kiddo, mental health, how they can be successful just in school and in life. And today we have a very special guest, Natalie Wigle. She is a licensed clinical social worker with Revitalist. And Natalie, we're tickled to have you on the show today. How are you?
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, sure. You want to tell our listeners a little bit about your background?
Yeah, sure. So I've been a clinical social worker for around 7 years and worked in like a bunch of different capacities as a social worker. But I started my career off as an international relief social worker, and then
Interesting.
kind of
Cool.
moved away from that. But I wanted to become a social worker since I don't know, since I was super little. My mom ran a few different homeless shelters growing up. And we, I grew up in China mostly. So about 15 years in Shanghai and Taiwan. And she ran homeless shelters there. And I was just enamored by what she did from a young age and wanted to do the same. So, um, yeah, so that's how I ended up here. But I worked with kiddos a lot. I spent a big portion of my beginning career in the foster care system, working with foster families and kiddos and their bio families. So, really got into the weeds of youth mental health and how their environments and how their families and things affect them really, really heavily.
Wow. What brought you guys back stateside?
Um, yeah, so I came back stateside for university. Um,
Mm.
and then I ended up moving a couple different places for work. And then came back here and fell in love and got married and had a baby.
No.
So now we're here. But it feels like home.
Congratulations on the baby.
Yeah, thank you. He's a bundle of
Yeah.
joy, that's for sure.
Are you planning to like just throw him in a baby pack and travel the world at some point and provide him with some of the same experiences that you had growing up? Because it sounds like those international experiences help develop a big part of who you are.
Yeah, definitely. I think more than that was like providing him with like, you know, modeling of like who you want to be as a person and like being a good human being. And that's what my mom was
Mm-hmm.
and my dad. So, but yeah, he's already has his passport. We've been to a couple different countries already with him. So,
That is
um,
so cool.
yeah, so hopefully he'll get some of that same experience, but we'll see.
What countries have you
Wow.
traveled to so far?
So he's been to Canada because that's where I'm originally from, to see family, and then we've also been to Mexico. So he's gotten the two ends so far, but hopefully we have plans in the future for him to explore too. So
That is so
Very
cool. My
cool.
little one is going to Canada in March. We have to go get his passport like this week.
okay, good luck. It's time consuming and expensive.
Oh, lovely. Love to hear it.
Yeah.
So you said that you work with kiddos. Like what age range do you typically work with?
Yeah, right now I work with mostly adults, but there's some like adolescents spread out, and then I worked for a few years with college age students at East Tennessee State University, and then before that I was working with kids from age infant all the way to 18 in the foster care system. So it was quite a broad range of ages, but I loved it. It was amazing.
Awesome.
What's the
So
like
go ahead, Candy.
pulse? Do you care if I ask a real?
Yeah,
I'm
go.
kind of amazed at the foster care piece, because I have just like so much respect and so much love goes out to those families who take these kids into their home and provide them with a loving, caring environment. Because it's that's a hard bridge to find yourself on metaphorically. Um, what's the state of foster care in the U.S. right now through your eyes?
Yeah, that's a tough question. It's a broken system. I
Mm-hmm.
think that the system is flooded with kids, and there's so much generational trauma that's not being addressed. So what ends up happening is just band-aids over everything, and that's how you catch yourself as a worker too, is just band-aiding problems and not really being able to help in the capacity that you would like to or need to, because there's just so much, there's so much trauma, there's so many kids, and so I know it's a job and a workforce that is really just stressed out and beaten down, and there's so much turnover because it is extremely heavy. But these kiddos, I mean, they're immensely resilient, and also they learn some really hard lessons in the foster care system. I think I know we're going to be talking about like self-regulation and like, how do you even do that when you don't have stability, when you don't have good models for that, when trauma has changed your brain chemistry so significantly. So I mean, it's just, there's so many angles that the kids are just really really struggling, and we have not done a good job supporting them in any way. So I think there's a lot of changes that need to be made. That's for sure.
Yeah. You just mentioned self-regulation. What is that? Can you tell our listeners if they don't know?
Yeah, so self-regulation is really, it's a life skill. It's how we manage and control our feelings, our thoughts, our behaviors, and it's how we're able to like interact with the world and build relationships and organize ourselves to be successful. It affects everything.
It really does affect it, everything. And, as a former educator in the public school system, Kristen and I were teammates. We actually taught fourth grade in the same school together. And we were blessed. We were in a great, great school. Pretty supportive parents. It was a good place, but we still had kiddos who didn't know how to self-regulate. But they're 10, they're 9 and 10. And so, once you like that teacher knowledge of students, once you got to know your kids, you started to see signs of dysregulation. You kind of would anticipate like triggers. But in your opinion, what does it really look like when a child is dysregulated?
Yeah, great question. So I think it's different for every kid, what that looks like for them. And it can range from, having a lot of outbursts. It can be, having these huge emotions that they don't know what to do with. But it can also show up as anxiety, depression,
Mm,
anger, irritability. And then on the other scale, it can show up as perfectionism. It can show up as a kiddo being extremely like rigid in their in the way they organize, like having some more like uh, compulsionary type of tendencies. So I think the spectrum is really large in how it can show up, but it definitely affects their relationships with other kids. It affects their ability to concentrate and to learn, for sure, in school. And I think it just affects how they see themselves as well. There's a lot of shame and guilt when you aren't able to self-regulate, because you feel out of control, and then you look back and you're like,
mhm.
why did I do that? Like, there's no answer, and so there's so much shame and then embarrassment and shame. I'm a big believer is a killer of all joy. So that's a really heavy thing for a kiddo to be carrying around all the time too.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's kids carry shame.
Yeah.
hmm I quickly learned as a teacher too. Um, I feel like when I started, I used to ask the kids why a lot. Like if they did something that they weren't supposed to do, if you were seeing like that like dysregulation, and I used to be like, why did you just do that? And then I very quickly realized like they don't know. They don't know why they just did that. Um, yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, very true. But I love that as adults, like we're also trying to understand. And so like in that way, like you're trying to help them, but it's like, wow, we both at this moment do not understand why this is happening, but it's so like, deep rooted, and it doesn't come out of nowhere for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's true. And I think, Kristen and I were talking about this before the show, and that can look differently depending on the situation or the environment, the dysregulation piece.
Yeah.
And so, we might have a kid displaying certain behaviors, strong feelings at school, and then they go home and, we're communicating with the parents, and the parents like, I've never seen that.
Mm.
Well, and so we're trying to find that link between, okay, is your child becoming dysregulated only at school, or is it happening at home, but it looks differently? What do you think about that? Do you think is that a thing?
Yeah, I definitely think that's a thing. I think you hit it like right on the nail of like, you know, it's it's a different environment. It can show up differently, and especially if there's an environment at home that's not safe, they may not feel like safe to express some of those emotions like anger or irritability. Where at school they know that maybe like they're not going to get you know the punishment that they maybe would at school. Or the vice versa, right? They feel a little bit safer at home, or they have more help at home and support, so they're able to use those other coping skills to regulate in a different way. But I think kids, you see it all the time in the grocery store, right? Like being in this environment that's maybe stressful, and they don't really know what to expect, and they're freaking out, and they're having this explosion of emotions. And in that moment, the parent is not really able to fully like be present with them, because they're worried about Joe Blow down the aisle, what he's thinking, and you're just trying to get the kid out the door, right? Get the kid back into the car or whatever. So I think there's moments where you can be more present with your kid, or the teacher can be more present to help in that way, and that makes a difference too.
Yeah, that's true. I'm a mom of a 17-year-old, and I know that I had quite a few parent teacher conferences back in the day, and I always really appreciated their feedback. Um, but I found through many years of parent teacher conferences that sometimes he would become dysregulated at school in a completely different way
Mm.
than he would if he did at home. And I think it goes right to that point where I don't think he felt safe sometimes in those environments
Mm.
at school. I don't think he always, and it was no fault really. I think the teachers were trying, but they just weren't quite meeting his needs. Now he had a couple of like amazing teachers who could spot. They knew his triggers, and they knew certain academic pressures, certain grouping, with other kids could be a potential trigger. But then there were the educators that maybe didn't, really get to know him as well. And so it would be a problem the whole year. And then we'd go into the next grade level, and we might have one situation and never hear of it again. And I think that kind of is how, maybe it's teacher experience. Like Kristen was saying, we all have to learn, right? We have to learn these things as we're growing as educators. But I'd get home and we'd have a conversation about it. And he'd be like, I don't know why I did that. And then after he had some time to kind of maybe self reflect, especially when he got a little bit older, he could pinpoint, well, you know, I was in this situation with this kid, and this kid was being disrespectful, and I didn't know how to handle it properly, and so I kind of lashed out. And that's where we started doing like role play and stuff like that to help him self regulate when he felt like he was in a situation that was spiraling. He could start to recognize, those feelings that are getting big, and it causes you to get a little wonky.
Yeah.
But you guys, yeah, I'm sure you've seen that too.
I think what you did is great and like perfect. I feel like, and what you're allowing him is to process and then practice, like to identify what those emotions are for him, to his triggers. But I think that's what we forget as adults is like, we have to learn this. It's not something that we're just born with and know how to self-regulate. I'm sure that, other kids are more successful than others just based on temperament or, environments or whatever. But that it takes practice. Like, we have to like really talk to our kids about this and help them learn how to process through that and identify for themselves. And, it's verbal processing is really important in that, and giving them a safe place to do that. It's important.
Kristen, did you have any, when you were in college, did you have any training on, I mean, I know you minored in psychology, I think, or something, right?
Yeah, that was my undergrad, was in psychology. And then I detoured into education for my graduate degree. But yeah, we had, I mean, it wasn't as intense as like a master's level program would be, because when you're undergrad in college, you still have to take like all those classes that are totally unrelated to like what you want to do and what you want to be. It's
Yeah,
kind of like a little more refined high school, but it's still, I mean, I had to take all sorts of like astronomy classes and like silly stuff like that. But I did have a clinical psychology class that kind of got into this. I also took an adolescent and a childhood development psychology class. So those kind of touched on this. Um,
hmm.
but I mean, that was 10 years ago now, 15 years ago,
Do you feel like
probably.
you were
So,
prepared?
oh, it totally helped
Were
with
you prepared
education.
for?
Oh, totally. An undergraduate
Hmm.
degree in psychology,
But
going into education, going into this job, even
yeah,
like it's just so relevant. I always knew I wanted to
yeah,
be a teacher, but the college that I went to didn't offer education as a major. So that's how I ended up in
yeah,
psychology, because I knew the college was more important. My mom worked there, so free tuition was the most
nice.
important, trying not to go into too much debt. So they didn't offer education. So I took psychology instead, and it was so helpful and so relevant.
Yeah.
I,
I had one, and I still have it, educational psychology. I took a class that was required in the education department where I went. And that was one of the most helpful classes when I actually went into the classroom. The pedagogy part, extremely well prepared. But when you get into the classroom and you're talking about all the social emotional elements that you deal with, and you have, 25 to 30 different personalities at a time, that's a whole lot. I feel like even in my training, that should have been more of a focus. I really feel like we should have had more education around those social emotional and psychology and those kinds of things. Natalie, I'm sorry. I think you were about to say something.
yeah, I was curious your experience as teachers of, when you have a kid or even a couple kids who are dysregulated, like how does that affect like the whole classroom, microcosm of the system? Like, how does that work for you guys?
I can tell you, I'll go first. Okay. It totally depends because there is a phenomenon. I don't know what it's called, but it probably is called something or will be called something. But let's say you have a cohort and they start together in kindergarten. And let's say the majority of the kids stay together until they're where they got to us in fourth grade. If there's a child that often dysregulates, or, you know, that let's just leave it at that, those kids on some level become um, not immune to it, but they develop coping skills to where if that child becomes severely dysregulated, they'll ignore, or they know with a look that it's time to evacuate the room from the teacher. Um, they're, but then if you have a class or a cohort that hasn't really had that, and then let's say a new child comes into the fold and they become, dysregulated on a regular basis, it can be really rough on the learning environment. It can be very, very difficult for kids to focus because they become, some of them, the little moms of the group want to help. or the ones who are incredibly sensitive to any kind, they're empaths even at a young age or whatever, they become very distracted. And then you have a demographic of kids who are quiet, they're not behavior problems, um, and they get paired with those kids who tend to dysregulate a lot because, they can maintain. It silently wears on them as well. Um, and by the time they get to fourth, fifth, sixth grade, now in sixth grade they get busted up a little bit more because there's the school's bigger and classes are different. But I've heard several children say that they start to resent, like being paired constantly, because it impeded they felt like it impeded their learning. So I know I kind of rabbit trailed there, but it can affect many different ways and things. And, you work closely with your school counselor, you work closely with your teammates. Hopefully you're able to work closely with the parents to support the kids. And, it just takes like a village to pull that off on a daily basis. Kristen, I know you have a zillion things you want to say too. Go for it.
The parent support is everything. It's very, very difficult to accomplish anything when you don't have the support of the parents. And I think as I became a veteran teacher after a few years, you really, really start to value and see those partnerships that you have with parents. And it is a partnership. Like Candy said, it takes a village. It is not anyone against anyone. It is all of us together teaming for this child to get them any and all supports that they need. And now as a mom, and I mean, my baby's only 10 months old, but now I see the protective side of it too as a parent. It has got to be so hard to go into those meetings and just hear what's going on. I'm so protective of my 10-month-old. Like I can't even imagine. So as a parent, I now see a totally new side of it that I thought I understood as a teacher, but I didn't understand as a teacher. You can't understand that mama bear until you are a mom. Like you can't, you can empathize with it and I thought I understood. I really did. But now that I am a mom, I didn't even have a clue what that would feel like. And I say that now, and then Cal will get older and he'll go to school and I'm sure I'll feel totally different about it at that stage in life. So it takes a village and it's such a team effort to get these kiddos what they need. Because like Candy said, I mean, if you have one or two children in your classroom, it really does change the vibe of everything. It changes how much you can get done as a teacher as far as academics and curriculum goes. You spend a lot more time in those mental wellness circles talking to your students about self-regulation, self-control. You spend a lot more time doing that than you actually do teaching some days. Some days we wouldn't get any teaching done because we're spending the whole time talking about rules and self-control and all those things. So Natalie, how would you, if there's a teacher listening, how would you recommend that they teach self-regulation? Like, how do you teach that to kids when they don't have fully developed brains yet?
Right. It's a great question. And I think, the way that we do that now is different because kids are experiencing such different things. I'm sure that you guys have experienced that yourself there's so much more pressure. There's so many other outside influences and external stressors that these kids go through. Social media, you have everything. So I think it's such a different thing now, but tried and true, one, it's just modeling. I think to to hold that like calm and present space for yourself as a teacher, to have your own like coping, your own self-regulation skills that work for you. And that's the same as parents too, you know, like when we can model for our kids how we do this, and that, you know, how we cope and deal with stress, how we cope with big emotions, that we're able to have them, but we can still like control the way we behave as well. So I think modeling is a huge one. And then co-regulation, you know, like you said, like our brains are still developing at that age. And then you throw in trauma or anything else that's going on. And there's so many factors going against them in that moment. And so really like, and this must be so difficult as a teacher. I can't imagine, because you know, you don't have as much one-on-one time with a kiddo, but, you know, even like from a group standpoint, of a classroom, of like practicing, you know, regulating with your kids on a daily basis, whether that's breathing techniques, whether that's, you know, like having time in your day to like check in. How are we doing? Like you're talking about that language, you're building those skills, because, you know, once that kid is in fight or flight, it's really hard to self-regulate. So when you can get them when they're calm and practice these skills, you're building that like muscle memory, you're building that ingrained in them. So when those times come, you know, that they're more readily available for them to use. So I think that's probably the best thing the teacher can do. And what a lovely way to spend some time in your day. You know, I'm sure the teachers need that themselves, you know, so it's like this group support of like, let's all like take a second, let's breathe, let's check into ourselves. I think it's important just as this whole society right now too.
Yeah, can't
we all just take a nice deep breath together?
Yes.
You know, that's so true. You made me think about having those moments of connection throughout the day, you know, with your kids, and it also made me think about foster families. And I think it's safe to say, and you can definitely correct me if I'm wrong, but I would say kids that are coming into those situations have been through a lot and may have a difficult time even knowing what self-regulation is. They may know they're out of control, but they don't know how to, because they have big feelings and they don't have the words and they're not developed. Then, you know, like back in the day, of course, I'm older than you guys are, and people would say things like, oh, just shake it off, or talking about children. They know exactly what they're doing. Well, they do to a certain extent, but they don't always know how to fix it. They're not little adults, you know, they don't have the brain development or the rationale in a lot of situations. Now, I do believe that there are kids that know that they are throwing 100% fit. They're doing it because they want something, but that's still dysregulation, right?
Yeah, I think manipulation, I think, is what oftentimes people say, oh, they're even they even talk about that with babies, you know, don't pick them up too much because they're manipulating.
I was going to say that. When Candy said that, it totally like set something off in my brain. Candy, do you know how many people have told me that Cal, my 10-month-old baby, is manipulating me to do things? And I'm like, he's 10 months old. He's not manipulating me. Like, he has needs that need to be met, and he has no words or any clue of how to communicate that to me. He's not manipulating me because he's crying at 2 a.m. He's not crying because he's hungry. Like,
it's survival.
Yeah.
You know? And like, I think that's what like we don't realize too, is like kids have needs, right? They're going to get them met, whatever means necessary, and that's survival. If we haven't given them the tools or the skills, or they haven't learned a way to do that in a more like appropriate, or, you know, the way that we would deem more palatable, then that's on us. You know, it's not on them. They don't have those skills yet. So, you know, and then we dysregulate them more because then we end up yelling at them, or, you know, putting shame onto them, like we were talking about before. And then they just shut down even further. And so that's a really hard cycle for a kid to be in, you know. It doesn't set them up for success, I think, that's for sure.
It's so true.
If you see a situation kind of heading in that direction, Natalie, like heading towards more of like a crisis situation, like what do you do?
Yeah. That's a great. I think oftentimes, I think Candy, you were talking about those quiet kids, the ones, and I think those are the ones I worry about the most. Is the ones who have been shut down, right? Because the ones who are outbursting and stuff, like, yeah, that I mean, they are still needing that support and that help, but they're still able to identify the emotion and express it. Whereas kids who have shut down, I think that's such a hard place to be in, because they don't feel safe enough to even express those emotions, and that leads to like really big issues later on in life, and then going back to safety. So I think intervention is really key. Like when we're headed into a crisis, and I would define a crisis with dysregulation. I mean, kids, like we talked about, like with survival, they will resort to whatever to get their needs met. And so when they don't have those skills, then there's suicidal ideation that comes up, there's self-harm, there's risk-taking behaviors, drug and alcohol abuse
Mm.
stem from that. You know Getting in relationships to get those needs met that are not healthy or safe. So I think, there's a lot of different ways to intervene, but giving support, like, having those one-on-one connection moments. I see you. I believe you. You're safe. Like, let's talk about this. It's like really showing up and being present with a kid, and it providing like a non-judgmental, safe space for them to come, is invaluable and so important, and something that a lot of kids don't have, unfortunately. Um, so I think as teachers, I know, especially when I worked in foster care, some of my kiddos were so immensely close to their teachers because it was their safe space. It was a place where they could come after class and feel cared for, feel seen and heard. And I'm sure that saved them in a lot of ways that teachers have no idea or realize for sure.
Yeah, maybe they do. Maybe they don't. I know personally, I had Kristen as well. We had several kiddos who ended up in and out of foster care. And my husband at one point, he was like, "You're going to turn into the old woman in the shoe with like 45 kids because you want to bring them all home with you." And I'm like, "I really do. Like, I want to just scoop them up and bring them home, yeah." So I think a lot of teachers do realize the impact, and that's one of the reasons they show up and come through the door every day. With the rigors of testing and legislative impacts that are imposed without their voice being heard. And they show up for the kids, they show up for the ones who need um, a positive role model. And because, most kids, the one thing I loved, well, there were many things about elementary age, is most of them just want to be loved. I guess all kids want to be loved, of course, but they're so little, and they want to be seen, and so you can just kind of like pour your heart into them for 10 months that you have them, but you probably made an impact that will last a really, really long time. Um, and I think about that in that vein, like if a child never learns to really self regulate, what does that look like later on in life?
Yeah, I think it looks like people who really struggle with relationships, maintaining positive
Mm,
relationships. I think it looks like people in survival mode, and trying to cope in other means. That intrinsic, uh, love for ourselves, our intrinsic kind of motivation, is self-regulation. And so when we also don't have that, then we seek outside of ourselves to get fulfillment, to get whatever it is. And I think that's where a lot of addiction issues stem from, trying to regulate, become, trying to get out of fight flight, trying to, whatever. um, but I also think that it looks like not being able to hold down a job, not being able
mm,
to, follow direction, not being able to trust, even like trust management, that they're going to have your best, interest at heart. So I really do think, it permeates every area of someone's adult life, all the way from home to work to, even the society level. Like, I imagine if we went to the prison system and, talked to them about how they self-regulated as a kid, or how they were taught that, how their environments set them up to do that, we would, hear some very sad stories, I'm sure.
That's true. Kristen and I are working on a series right now for Stand for Kind about suicide awareness. And I was just taking notes as you were speaking, because there are so many parallels between suicidal ideation and what you just discussed of failure to self regulate. One of the big things after talking to Robin from TAP also was that suicidal ideation or attempted suicides are oftentimes impulsive behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
And so you were saying, without being able to self regulate, one can tend to be more impulsive, which, if it's coupled with adverse situations in their life or another a mental illness, then that impulsivity could translate perhaps into suicidal ideation, which is a very final and sad, if completed, you know, behavior, I guess. So it goes, I don't know, maybe I'm jumping too far, but it just seems like at the core, being able to know oneself and regulate and develop resiliency and those coping skills can help one overcome some of those more adverse events, rather than something bad happens. It's the quote unquote end of the world. It'll never be good for me. I'll never get over this. The world hates me. All that negative self-talk stuff kind of starts to perpetuate, I guess, in the brain.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that negative self-talk is fear-based, and I think fear relates to self-regulation so much too. Feeling out of control, not having, feeling grounded, I think creates a lot of uncertainty and fear. And I think I think most people that attempt suicide or complete suicide, that is not ever where they saw themselves going, and it often happens because they have gotten up. They realize that there's no hope for them, there's no hope that things can get better. And I think, that becomes relating back to impulsivity, but also that fear that is embedded when you don't have that self-assurance, or the capacity to handle those big life things that, most people get dealt. It's really difficult. But I think when you can give back hope to somebody, that's when you really, talking about what do we do, right? Of getting them to feel more confident about themselves, gives back hope, being able to have more control within themselves when other things in their life are not being able to have control is super important.
I think as a kid too, it's really hard to, we talk about the finality of everything. It's really hard to kind of understand that as a kid, because everything is here and now and what's happening in the moment. And sometimes when you get into these negative self-talk cycles, it just kind of spirals out of control. How do you teach positive self-talk? How do you teach your kids to do that?
Yeah, I think that's one of my favorite things to teach, and I'm still learning it myself. But I think we have to talk about self-compassion, first, of really, fighting with that thought of, so often we have thoughts and we just believe them automatically. And they come from a real deep-seated place, but it's having those skills of being able to fight back, of questioning, is that true? Can I have a kinder stance of myself? I do this thing with clients all the time, but we will name, their
yes.
negative talk monster. I had a lady the other day name hers Karen, which I think is very appropriate. But talking back against that. And like, where is that voice coming from? Is this your voice, or is this, a voice of a kid who was really mean to you growing up? Is this a voice
Mm,
and a collection of things that you've been told from others and how you've internalized that? Um, and then going back to like how we talk to our friends, of like if we could all talk to ourselves in the way that we talk to our little kiddos or our dear friends or our loved ones. And so really like, there's Kristen Neff is a self-compassion researcher who is an amazing.
mm,
I really encourage any parent or anybody just to look that up. She has a TED talk and then some books out there, but she talks about like the value of self-compassion, and it is the path of least resistance. It's really hard to bully yourself into change. That doesn't work well. And so, setting yourself up for success and being able to, be more successful and, live more within your values by being kinder to yourself and giving yourself, uplifting, an encouragement to be able to do the things that you want to do.
yeah. I love that you name our big feelings. Its name is Timmy. And so in our household, when we're having big feelings and we're like getting anxiety ridden or getting upset about something, we're like, Timmy's about to blow. So, and then it makes us laugh, like infusing some humor into that. And I used to do this with some of my kids who were having very, very difficult moments. And sometimes we would talk about, that's not who you are, honey. That's how you feel right now, and that's okay. And where is that coming from? And let's name them. They'd be like, "What, Miss Olet?" They would just think it was so silly, and it wasn't dismissing their feelings at all, right? But trying to get them back into a more maybe rational part of their brain, de-escalate the situation a little bit, maybe get some humor in there, not laughing at them, but with them, kind of situation. But I do know that one of the things when we became parents is, my husband had to work on his self regulation when he would become frustrated with our son's behavior. Nobody prepares you for that. I mean, you think your parents are modeling it, but you have to learn yourself and your own technique on how to self regulate so then that you can deal with that out of control or dysregulated child in a safe way, a gentle but firm way. And there's this lady that I've been following. I don't know if you've seen her. She's called Mrs. T. Her name is Mrs. T. She's an educator. And she talks about the in control of out of control child. So the child is in control of the entire classroom, but they're out of control behavior. So they throw and they destroy everything, and they throw things. And Kristen and I have lived this. They throw things at you, at the other children. They're harmful. They're breaking things. You have to immediately be able to assess that situation, make sure the other 30 kids, 25 kids, whatever, are safe, and then help that child to regulate. And we're seeing more and more of those videos pop up on the internet of these dysregulated kiddos and these educators that maybe are tired, they're trying their best, they don't have support, from parents or whatever. And maybe some of them do. I don't know. I hate to generalize, but when they're trying to help these kiddos cope and learn the skills, but do they have the skills? Like I think our social emotional learning and all of these things, school systems need to make sure that this is just totally my opinion. I'm kind of going off on a little tangent here, but they need some more support, on how to de-escalate. And I know there's some great programs out there like PBIS and some other ones that are trying to help teach those kinds of things. But when you think about, we talked about the long-term effect of not being able to self-regulate. It's pretty significant, What are some other resources? You mentioned Kristen Neff, that parents can tap into to help.
Yeah, there's some great ones, and I don't know if I have them off the top of my head, so I'll have to share with you after, and give you some
Okay.
resources there. But I did want to touch on, just I thought what you were saying was super important, of repair, because I think as adults, like you were highlighting, we often don't have those skills ourselves, and we're still learning. And like repairing with our kids, be like, hey, like
Mm,
I'm so sorry, I got angry and I yelled, and I in that moment, that's not what I wanted to do, and I'm really sorry that I handled it in that way. Can we talk about that? Like, because that will happen. I think for teachers too, like how overwhelming is what kept coming up in my head, of like, you have 30 kids that you're trying to make sure that they learn, that they're all safe, that they're all being kind to one another. And like, that's a huge task. That's overwhelming. And so, like, of course you're going to fail at your own self-regulation, because it's a high stress environment. And so I think, that is something that we often forget, is like repairing, because how good does that feel to that kiddo, that when you had that failure of dysregulation, um, that they experienced that, and they took that into their bodies, and maybe they internalized that. But if you can come back to them and say, I'm so sorry, that was wrong, that heals their bodies, that heals their little souls, and it gives them that
mm-hmm.
like, oh, I can fail at this, and I'm still a good person, and I can come back and I can say I'm sorry and try again. And that is, I think, the most important thing in parenting, and I'm sure as being a teacher, but like coming back and saying, like, let's try this again.
Yeah. Let's try that. Yes, I agree with you from that parent perspective 100%, because there are times that I have said to my son, I am sorry. I That was not the appropriate reaction in the moment. I realize that now. No one is perfect. I'm certainly not perfect, but we're going to learn from this, and I'm going to learn from this. As a teacher, you don't have the luxury of making those kinds of mistakes. If you do dysregulate, it's not good. You're really not allowed to be human in that respect. Um, you're judged, I believe, pretty heavily if you become the slightest bit dysregulated. We had a situation one time where we were going on a soft lockdown, and our kids were on the playground, and there had been an armed robbery not far from the school, and so they were pulling us off. And that's a scary situation when you have 90 kids and there are four of you adults watching those kids. Maybe it's not quite that many on the playground, and you're trying to get them back in the building as soon as possible, because at the moment we didn't know what the threat was. We just knew that we were going on a lockdown, and at that time there were active shooter things happening in the community, not our community, but around the United States. So, you always have that. Your number one priority, or at least mine was, just to keep my kids safe and get them home safely every day. And when we were going on that soft lockdown, I had a couple of kids that we had procedures in place. They knew when they heard the whistle, they knew how many beeps when they heard the whistle, that they were immediately supposed to stop what they were doing. We practiced these things. The kids just didn't want to come off the playground. And there were two of them, and they were a good kind of click away from the rest of the group, and we've got most of them coming in. And so I had to raise my voice, not in a hateful way, but I just had to raise it so they would hear me. Please come inside. Well, there happened to be a parent walking by and heard it and complained that I was yelling at the children. So, and took it out of context, didn't realize we were going on a soft lockdown, didn't ask questions. You know what I mean? Just automatically assumed that the teacher was dysregulated and being unkind. When in fact, it's a very stressful situation. You don't know. We didn't know at the time that they were, maybe a half mile away this was happening. It wasn't immediate right on campus. You know what I'm saying? So it can be hard for teachers. When you're a parent behind closed doors and you become dysregulated, there's nobody really judging you except yourself. and you can come back and say, I'm sorry, and repair that. But when you have community stakeholders judging you, it is a whole different ballgame, man.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm so glad, it's like we don't really think about, and this is my first time really talking in depth to teachers in this capacity, but you don't really think about like how much pressure and stress that would create, always being on the spotlight, having, a lot of responsibility, and not a lot of appreciation, I don't think either. That's a really hard place to be.
It is. It
Yeah.
can be sometimes. But I'm glad that there are people like you out there that are helping kids to learn how to self regulate so that as we grow up, we could become adults that have tools in our toolbox,
Mm.
right? To be able to do that properly.
Yeah,
I'm
sure.
sorry, Kristen, what were you going to say?
Um, oh, I was going to say you also get, in addition to that, like a parent happens to be there and see something happen. You also have kids who interpret things in different ways or in different contexts than it actually happened, and then go home and tell their parents, "Hey, guess what happened at school today?" And then you get that whole side of the pressure too of them thinking that something happened that was totally out of context and didn't actually happen at all.
Yeah. And I'm sure kids use that to their advantage, or, their own survival with their parents. And,
Mm-hmm.
it's a hard place to be in, I think.
Yeah,
That's why
it
we
is.
need trust. We need trust between school and home, like Kristen said too, and you've said we need trust.
Mm.
It's a village approach,
Yeah.
and not to be an old fart, but back in my day, don't you love that saying? If I came home with a note from my teacher saying that I had been disrespectful, oh my word,
Mm.
were there consequences?
Right.
Yes, ma'am, there were consequences. Um, and I think in a lot of households, there still are consequences. But then you see, a percentage of parents are like, my kid, is beautifully regulated all of the time. And it must be everyone else revolving around them. And you're like, oh my gosh, they're,
Yeah.
we
It seems
just want
like
your
a
kid to be the best they can be.
right, right. Yeah, I love that you said like we're trying our best too. We want the best, but it does seem like a very like us versus them. That I think there's just probably echoes what it's society, that polarization, just right now in
Yeah.
our world. But I think it does, and I've heard that from clients, where they're venting about their teacher or their child's teacher, and it does like demonize them in some way. It's like this us versus them mentality. And I think you're
Mm-hmm.
right. If I came home with a note like that too, back in my day, my that would be a serious they like there was that treat, like I'm going to support this teacher because I know that like if they're writing this letter that was true, and there's no reason
Mm-hmm.
for them to come come bring you this information other than just trying to help. So
Yeah.
it is a strange thing that's happening, I think, for sure.
Yeah. We were talking about earlier going into the parent teacher conferences.
Mm.
I mean, try to be objective as possible
Yeah.
because, it's hard when it's your kid, to be objective because you're the mama bear, like Kristen was saying, you like want to protect them. It's in your DNA, or you're a dad or a partner of whatever you care about that child. Um, is it when you go in there, it's so hard to be objective, but you really have to go in with an open mind and just understand that kids are going to become dysregulated. They're going to make poor choices. For heaven's sakes, adults make poor choices. It's just life, and they're learning. And like school is the training wheels for life,
Right. Yeah, and I think like, to tie back into the where we started was shame, and I think it's for some reason we shame parents too if their kid is having a behavior issue. It becomes,
Right.
a reflection on them as a person or as a human being. And so I think like the conversation just needs to change of like, this is a normal thing that happens for kids. Like we have to teach, we have to learn it. And it doesn't mean that they're a bad kid. These are good kids that are trying to get their needs met. And these are good parents who are trying their best. And these are good teachers who are also trying their best. So I wish that we could all have that self-compassion for one another and take that shame component out. I feel like it would help a lot.
I do too. I know that you've recently helped develop a curriculum on brain health for adolescents called Stand Kind. And when you guys were working through like that self-regulation piece and breathing techniques and things like that, were you pulling from like specific experience as you guys were crafting that piece of the curriculum?
Yeah, I think for sure I was of what works and what doesn't, but also pulling from my own what works and what doesn't for myself, because I think they're the same, but yeah, I think especially my experience in foster care, and giving a kid some space to do that and some time to do that and building it in as a practice. I think that's really where I was highlighting that in the curriculum of let's make this more of like a routine.
Good call. Kristen, do you have any other questions or anything you wanted to ask our expert here?
Just one last thing. So as we kind of wrap everything up, what is like the one takeaway that you would want parents or educators or anyone listening to know about self-regulation and how to help their kids?
Yeah. I think the one takeaway for me is that you have a really good kid who just needs some help. And so co-regulation is like, do that together, build it into your routine, build it into the way that you interact with one another, help them with that. But they're a good kid, just having a moment. And I think the more that we really hone in on that is going to be really beneficial, and just have the kids see themselves, which is the most important thing too.
Yeah, it's great advice. Well, Natalie, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your time, your willingness to talk, and your expertise.
I also liked hearing you guys and your perspective. That was awesome. Thanks for having me.
Oh,
you're
very kind. That's cool. Well, we'll look forward to if you want to send some additional resources to help parents and teachers learn to regulate, self-regulate, co-regulate. I love that. That was a new term for me today. We'll make sure that we link those and make them available. But definitely going to look up Kristen Neff. I'm curious to listen to her TED Talk. I think that'll be pretty cool.
Yeah, she's wonderful. And I'll definitely send you those things for sure.
All right. Thanks. We appreciate you.
Okay, thank you guys.